So I think there's three main things that three main things that I've taken away from starting companies, and the first is luck and timing, and it's not the reliance on luck or the reliance on fortune. It's being able to cultivate a sense of awareness and recognizing when you're in a lucky or fortunate environment or situation. So the idea behind Twitter actually started when I was 15 years old, and I became fascinated by maps. So fascinated that I taught myself how to program so I could put a map on the screen, and then I could put these little blue dots on the screen, and I learned how to move the dots around. And then I had the most beautiful thing, I thought, ever in the world, which was this gorgeous map of the metropolis with all these moving dots. But the dots had no meaning whatsoever. So I started looking for meaning, and I found these open databases of real-time movements for couriers, taxis, and 911 emergency vehicles. And I hooked them up to these dots, and suddenly I had a rich sense of the life of a metropolis. But the only thing that was missing from this was the citizens, was my friends. So I tried various times to, get my friends on, and I had the first BlackBerry, and I took the BlackBerry to Golden Gate Park and was in front of the bison paddock, and it would send out an email to a program that would distribute it to all my friends saying, I'm at the bison paddock. And I learned right away that my friends did not care, and no one else had a BlackBerry. So the timing was off. But in 2006, SMS got really big in this country, and this was the first time that you could send a message from Verizon to Singular. And I fell in love with this technology. I thought it was very rough around the edges. It barely worked. But it worked on these very, very simple cell phones, these $20 cell phones that you could bring anywhere and report where you are. And at that time, I happened to be working at a company called Odeo. And Odeo was a podcasting company. And the fortunate thing about Odeo being a podcasting company is no one in the company was a podcaster. No one cared about building podcasting tools. So it allowed for some exploration into other ideas. And this is where Twitter was brought up. So in concert with SMS being what it is, brought the idea up to my two co-founders who were running an audio company. So shifting from audio to text and real-time text-based social network would be normally challenging for most people, but not these two guys because they came from Blogger. So this was a very fortunate and safe and supportive environment to talk about this idea. And 2 years later, we won a plastic monkey, so the whole thing worked out. In Square's case, my first boss when I was 15 is a man named Jim McKelvey. And he was an engineer for a long time, and then he got into glass blowing. And he builds these glass faucets, and they sell for about $2,000. And I reconnected with him December of 2009, and we were just discussing, and he had just lost a sale of a glass faucet. And he lost it because he could not take a credit card. The only thing the woman had was an Amex card, and he was unable to take it. And here we were both talking on our iPhones, which are these amazing little tiny computers that can do anything, but he couldn't complete that sale. So we went and discovered why that was the way it was. And the other thing that was happening in the world was the financial world was crashing around us. And all of these abstractions that we built up, derivatives, CDSs, they're all falling down, and everything has been cleared away. Management teams have been moved out. And banks and structures like Visa and MasterCard are suddenly more open to thinking in an innovative way and to working with smaller companies. So this event, this environment, allowed Jim and I to very quickly go into banks like Wells Fargo and to Chase and to Visa and talk to the very tops of the organization and sell them on the prototype that we just built. So the second biggest thing for me is there's a lot of ideas in the world, but you can't really actualize them until you see them outside of your own head. So it's very important for me to draw. and to take a notepad and to really get it out of my head, get a different perspective, and really play with the ideas, and also be able to show it to others. So this was the first drawing for Twitter in 2001, and this is when I worked on the BlackBerry client. Very, very simple, and it looks very similar to what you see today with Twitter, which is just a box and a timeline underneath. A lot of the marketing, of course, was all wrong. But the idea, this allowed me to really play with the ideas and, more importantly, show it to other people. And I took that to an extreme in Square's case, where I had the benefit of having a prototype in a month, and I could go around to people like Ron Conway and show him the receipt. Hey, Ron, we want to test the swiping distance on your black card. Where's your black card? Hey, Ron, we just changed the font on the receipt. Really want to show it to you. Where's your black card? I made $100 from Ron just taking his money, showing him features, and getting his feedback and iterating. But the important thing was that someone like Ron and all the people that we brought into the company as engineers could immediately play and experience what we were doing. So it was out of our heads. We could figure out if it was something or if it was something that we should move off from. And the third one is I treat the role as CEO, and I treat a company as more or less a glorified editor. I think it's really important to focus on taking all of the inputs that one has and really being able to bring an editorial voice to the product and to the team and to the bank. Everything that goes on with the company has an oversight and an editor that's kind of arranging and saying no to a lot of things, but saying yes to some other things. This was the first interface for Twitter, and some things you notice about this is it's asking the question, what's your status, which is just a terrible question, and not something that really encourages you or inspires you to answer it in the way that people use Twitter today. In fact, almost everything that you see in Twitter today came from our users. The @replies, the little @ symbol before the username, that came from our users. Everyone in the company thought it was the ugliest thing in the world, and we were resistant to it. But one day I took 3 hours and I programmed it so anything that came after that @ symbol would be linked to a user profile page. The hashtag, the retweet, the word tweet, all that came from our users, and all of that was resisted initially by the company until we really recognized that this is the way that people want to use the system. So how do we make it easier? How do we make it more convenient? And how do we edit it into the narrative of what is known as Twitter? In Square's case, we originally started the company with a kind of identity crisis. We had no good names, and we started the company with a name called Squirrel, and had this concept of an acorn. And this was great, but thinking back, if I was up here and talking about a company called Squirrel, I wouldn't really feel that good about myself. Square is just a much, much better brand, and something that we, when we moved away from this name and from this idea and from this concept, we were heartbroken because we thought it was the best name ever, but all the feedback we were getting was pointing to the opposite. And then we ran into a company that owned it in trademark in Canada, which also had the trademark, so it made the decision very easy. But there's something about that recognizing that fortunate and lucky situation, drawing it out, and then iterating as quickly as possible, not only to share it with people and to see it in the world, but to also recognize when it's time to put it away and to move on to the next thing. And that's really the hardest thing to do, is to put something away and to realize it might not be the right time, it might not be the right pacing, it might not be the right team, but it's something that you can pull from later. So it's really important to know when you should end. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Jack. He's actually given 3 presentations over the last 2 days, so thanks a lot for that. Our next speaker, Jagdeep Singh, is an entrepreneur in residence with us, and we're continually trying to find more ways to broaden that relationship. He's the ripe old age of 43. He went to college when he was 15, so he's had plenty of time to do 4 startups. I think they've all been successful, 3 with Vinod, and his last one was Infinera, which went public in 2007. So very successful and been a great addition to our team as well. So let me introduce Jagdeep Singh.
Thanks, Samir. Okay, looks like the wrong slide deck is up on the screen. So I actually I had my slides on a USB stick, and it must have had the presentation from 2 years ago at the Kozlo Venture Summit, which is the one that's up here. So I'm not going to talk with no slides at all, which is fine because the slides are mostly just visual aid. So Samir and Vinod asked me to talk a little bit about when to sell a company. And what I thought I would do was just compare 2 experiences that I had. Both of them happened to be with Vinod, in fact, 2 companies that I started over the last several years with different outcomes. And just use that as a framework to talk about when to sell, at least from my standpoint. So the first company is a company called Lytera Networks that was started in the late 1990s, and it was an optical switch company. It was started in the wake of a development called wave division multiplexing, which was a technology that allowed multiple colors of light to be put onto a single glass fiber, an optical fiber network, and expanded the capacity of these fibers by literally an order of magnitude or more, by 20, 30, 40 times compared to what you had with a single wavelength. This was pioneered by a company called Sienna in the late 1990s. WDM became sort of a household name in the telecommunications industry. Every carrier was deploying WDM equipment. But it had sort of a problem that it was going to create, which was that now these fibers had 40, 50 times more capacity per fiber on the glass, but there was no way to switch that bandwidth around. All the switches were still single wavelength. So it was clear to anybody who was thinking about this problem that there was a massive opportunity to build multi-wavelength switches that could handle all this capacity with multiple colors of light and do it the same way that traditional switches did. So that was the basic problem that Lytera set out to solve. We built a switch, and everything was going really well. And then within about, less than a year after we started the company, about 10 months to be precise, we got an offer from Sienna, the company that had pioneered WDM, to buy us for a price north of $500 million. So it was interesting. We actually had 3 venture capitalists in that company. We had raised a total of about 16 million, of which 10 was still in the bank. Vinod was one of the 3 investors. He actually wasn't on the board, but it was an interesting story because, if you think about, we thought about the decision with the board, and we said, okay, what are the pros and cons of selling? Well, the pros of selling the company were, a lot of risks still lay ahead of us. We'd only been 10 months into the development cycle. It was unclear, all of the development risk was ahead of us. All the customer risk was ahead of us. The financing risk was ahead of us. The VCs were getting a 15 to 20 times return on their money in less than a year, depending on whether they went to Series A or Series B. Vinod was in the Series B, and the Series A guys were on the board. For the board, it was a no-brainer. They basically said, hey, 15, 20x our money in a year, of course, we should take this and do it. Interestingly enough, Vinod actually had the opposite point of view. He thought we shouldn't sell the company. And at the end of the day, the board decided to sell the company and take the money, if you will. In hindsight, looking back with 20/20 vision, that was probably a mistake. And it was a mistake for the following reason. The company was clearly had a lot of customer interest, which was very, very encouraging. But we didn't have any real customer wins because we didn't have product that we were shipping yet. But Vinod had actually seen the customer interest. He'd been in these customer meetings. The other VCs hadn't, so he saw that was real. But more importantly, the Infinera product, the Lytera product had a unique quality that actually many startups don't have, and it's something that I think is really important to have for a startup to build a permanent company. And that's this notion of what I call stickiness. The definition of stickiness in my mind is how hard is it for your customer to switch away from you to a competitive product if they hate you. So a good example of stickiness is yesterday Bill Gates was talking. Bill Gates is where he is because he has a very sticky product. There's I don't know how many thousands of applications run on Microsoft Windows, and even if you hate Windows, you still use Windows because the apps run Windows. You can't afford to switch to something else. The iPhone is now a platform because it has lots of applications, and you can't really switch away from that. Juniper and Cisco are sort of monopolies in the network because they have these protocols which are effectively proprietary. Even though they're officially standards in the internet, they're basically proprietary protocols, and that nobody trusts any other implementation of those protocols. So they're kind of locked in that sense. Well, the Lightera product, which is a switch, had that same level of stickiness. It had a protocol. All these switches in the network, different parts of the North American fiber optic network, for example, communicated with each other with this protocol. And in doing that, they created a proprietary network within the customer's environment. So when the customer needed a new switch node in another city, they couldn't go to Lucent or Nortel or Alcatel and buy another switch. They had to buy another Lightera switch because that was the only way they worked with their infrastructure. And they'd have to throw out the whole network to upgrade. And it turns out because of the stickiness factor, the product, in fact, has done really well. So Ciena, the product was called Core Director. Ciena acquired it. I think it did about $300 million in its very first year of shipment. Over the last few years, it's literally sold billions of dollars worth of revenue for Ciena. And it's deployed in every major telecom network, from AT&T to Verizon to British Telecom, Telefonica, you name it, are deploying the product. And this is all very, very clear in hindsight because you can look at the product success and so on. But what really, that was the first time I worked with Vinod, and frankly, the reason why I worked with Vinod for my next two companies was because of that experience. It was very clear that the advice he provided in terms of not selling was actually very good advice. And had we listened to it, we probably could have built a really, really great independent company. It wasn't a bad outcome. It made me a lot of money. Everybody, even the receptionist, I think, made over $1 million, so because there was no dilution in the company. But it could have been a really high impact company if we'd done that. Let me contrast this with my second narrative, which is Infinera. It's a company Samir mentioned. Infinera was started just after the telecom bubble burst in 2001. And what we were doing was going after the same market. All I really know is telecom. And we basically, this time, went after the WDM market itself, the transmission of those multiple colors of light. And the key insight we had was that the cost of those optical transmission systems was really high because they were all built of discrete optical components, things like lasers and modulators and photodiodes. And these things cost a few $1,000s per component. And they were really expensive fundamentally because the optomechanical packaging around the chips was really expensive. So the laser diode chip itself only cost a few tens of dollars, but the optomechanical packaging that goes around the laser diode chip costs maybe $1,000. The same for the modulator, which turns light off and on. The same for the photodiode that receives the light and so on. And so we realized that if you could integrate all these optical functionalities into a single photonic integrated circuit, you could dramatically lower the cost of WDM. And that's what we set out to do. At the time, it was considered a very, very risky project technically. In fact, many people thought it was just not doable. But we were too stupid to know that, and we went ahead and raised some money and built a team and tried to go off and solve the problem. And the question for us at that point became, what do we do with this company? It became clear after we started that we needed enormous amounts of money. We knew we needed to raise, several $100 million. In fact, over $300 million was what we ended up needing to raise. And then, we probably would have been one of the highest funded companies ever, if not for KR, who raised, I don't know, $500 million or something. So he's taken that crown from us. But basically, there was huge financing risk. There was huge technology risk because we didn't know if we could do this or not. And there was huge market risk because the customers we were selling to, the telecommunications carriers, were in a very difficult position economically. So the question became, what do we do? Do we try to actually go forward with this company, or do we try to sell the company and get an exit? And fortunately, I had learned my lesson from Lightera, and we decided to go forward with the company. We built a phenomenal team, and the team executed just really, really well. And they actually built these chips, which people thought weren't doable. And once we had the chips, we were able to build systems around the chips. And within the first year of shipment, we ended the year as the #1 supplier of optical equipment in North America. Just last quarter, the company actually had a 38% share the WDM market. This is against incumbents like Nortel and Lucent and Alcatel and Huawei, the Chinese entrant, and so on. So it's a great accomplishment. The company will do around $400 million revenue this year. The company went public in 2007. Just overall, everything's going really well for the company. And it wouldn't have happened had we not learned that lesson from the Lytera days. So I guess the key takeaways here are that when you're starting a company, you want to make sure that you have an alignment of interests between what your goals are and what your investors' goals are. In particular, if you're trying to swing for the fences and build a really great enterprise, you want to get investors that want to do the same thing, that are motivated by hitting the ball out of the park. In the Lytera case, we had investors that were very nice people, but in the end, they were financial investors. They wanted to make a buck, and they did. But in the process, it could be argued that an opportunity to build a great company was squandered. One of the reasons why I work with Coastal Ventures is precisely because I think there's a clear alignment here of interest, and the goal is to build really great disruptive companies. I've seen many of what you guys are doing, and it's just there are some really great opportunities here to build permanent companies, and hopefully you guys are of the same opinion that your goal is to build real companies and try to just hit the ball out of the park there. So that's really what all I had to say. And I think if you have any questions, I can take a few questions right now before we turn it over and get you guys back on track. Samir?
Jagdeep, I mean, a lot of the entrepreneurs here are first-time entrepreneurs, barely making rent. And so how did that factor in for you personally in terms of selling companies or not? Getting that first nest egg versus shooting big?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I ask people this question. So those of you that are engineers or MBAs, thinking about things in terms of expected value of a decision, right? So what's the expected value of, if you flip a coin, a fair coin, 50% probability, and if heads, turns out to give you, if you make $10 million if it's a heads, but if it's tails, you lose, I don't know, $1 million, and your net worth is zero, which mine was when I started my first company. Do you take that bet or not? Well, if you're purely rational, you say, yeah, it's a great bet because on average you make $4.5 million, and so you should flip that coin all day long. The reality, of course, is that if your net worth is zero, you can't afford to lose $1 million. So it's probably you might not want to take that bet. And for my first venture, which was actually even before Lytera, I actually, to be quite candid with you, was motivated by financial return, and I was fortunate that there was a good financial outcome for that company many years ago. So by the time I got to Lytera and Infinera, I didn't really need the money anymore, and I wanted to really build a great company and make an impact. So I had the luxury, if you will, of doing that. I think it's a very personal decision if it's your first startup, what you want to do. There are great examples of first-time CEOs that build great companies without needing to make a buck. But the question becomes more complicated if you're looking at, if you've got a company and if you sell, you can walk away with $20 million tomorrow versus, slogging it out for another 2-3 years and maybe end up with nothing at the end of the day. So you just have to kind of think hard about what your goals are, what motivates you, and so on. It's just easier if it's your second or third company. Any other questions I can provide some perspective on for anybody else? If not, we'll get you back on track.
Thanks.